Long before kings rose or battles shook the soil, before coins rang in marketplaces or roads stitched the world together, there was only silence. Not empty silence, but a living hush, the kind that moves like breath through leaves at dawn, that settles over stone like soft dust in a forgotten room. In the Zagros Mountains, where the land folds in quiet waves and the sky leans close to the earth, a whisper passed from peak to peak. It was not a voice, not quite, but a memory carried by wind, the memory of fire kindled by trembling hands, of hunters wrapped in furs chasing deer by torchlight, of mothers humming to newborns beneath animal hide tents. This land, before it bore the name Persia, belonged to no one and everyone, to the stars that watched it, to the soil that fed the goats, to the rivers that knew no border but the thirst of the roots they touched. Here, the first stories were not written in stone or clay, but in the trails worn by bare feet, the paths marked by smoke rising against the cold. Men believed in the breath of the mountains, in the spirits that lived in trees, in the sacredness of fire that refused to go out through the night. The fire, always the fire, not worshipped in grand temples, but tended quietly in small hearths, glowing against the dark like a heartbeat. They believed, too, in things they could not name, shapes in the mist, songs carried by owls, dreams that spoke in symbols older than any tongue. These early people, Elamites, Medes, wandering tribes without banners, were not yet Persians, but the silence they listened to was the same silence that would later echo through the corridors of Persepolis. They slept close to the earth, pressed against each other for warmth, with dogs curled at their feet and children clinging to their mothers' sides. When they woke, it was not to clocks or chimes, but to the scratch of stone on stone, to goat bells, to the faint rustle of wind stirring the brush. Their lives were small, but not insignificant. In the curve of a clay bowl, in the soot on a stone wall, in the rhythm of a lullaby, the shape of something larger began to form, not a kingdom yet, but the soft outline of a future empire curled like a child in sleep. They grew barley and wheat where the rivers ran kind. They learned to fire pots, to spin wool, to trade salt for figs, obsidian for meat. They scratched symbols into wet clay and let the sun bake their stories into permanence. They buried their dead with food and tools, believing, perhaps, that the next world would not be so different from this one. And always, they watched the sky not with fear, but with patience. The stars moved with a purpose they could not yet grasp, but somehow understood. When the moon was full, they told stories around fires. When comets streaked across the night, they fell silent, listening for what came next. Beneath the ground, copper slept in veins. In the forests, wolves waited, watching. The world was not tame, but it was not hostile either, only indifferent, vast, and old. To live here was to learn rhythm of season, of soil, of silence. And so, in the folds of these mountains, where cold wind whispered through pine and ash, a people began to gather, to settle, to shape the land as it shaped them. They built no monuments, carved no grand statues, but they watched, and they remembered. And memory, like fire, needs only the faintest spark to leap into flame. So when the first kings rose not with crowns, but with the trust of their kin, they rose not from ambition, but from necessity. A man who could organize the grain, who could make peace between quarreling families, who could speak for the village when strangers came, such a man became more than a man. He became the first breath of kingship, the first murmur of empire, and he, too, would bow to the mountain, would whisper to the fire, would lie down beside his people, and hear the same wind through the same trees. In time, names would emerge, tribes would weave into alliances, alliances into nations. But it all began here, in the quiet cradle of the East, under a sky wide enough to hold 1,000 years of dreams. Nothing was rushed, the land did not allow it, crops took their time, children grew as slowly as olive trees. Even wars, when they came, moved like thunder in the distance before arriving with lightning. There was no single day when the Persian Empire was born, no trumpet, no proclamation, only a slow gathering of moments. A field cleared, a road walked, a bargain struck under an almond tree. The empire came as all real things do, not suddenly, but with the weight of inevitability, like snow building on a branch until it breaks. In that break, history begins. But even then, beneath the noise of what is written, there is the whisper of what came before the hush of the hills, the breath of the fire, the footsteps of a people not yet called Persian, but already dreaming of a name. Their bones lie under the same earth that would one day hold kings. Their laughter echoes, faint but not gone, in the rustling of reeds beside ancient streams. Their shadows stretch through time, reaching toward a city not yet imagined, a throne not yet built, a legacy not yet carved in stone. But the wind remembers, the mountains remember, and the fire never forgot. It still burns, somewhere in the dark, waiting for the next story to begin. In a quiet valley, touched by sunrise and the soft curve of olive trees, a child was born not in the chambers of a palace, or to the sound of trumpets, but in the hush of fields just beginning to stir with spring. His name would echo through marble halls and deserts alike Cyrus. But on the day of his birth, he was simply a small, blinking creature swaddled in linen and warmed by the breath of his mother, her voice a murmur against the wide silence of the hills. The stars were clear that night, and old women pointed to them as omens, though none could say exactly what they meant. In Anshan, among the Elamites and Medes, life passed like the slow unfurling of a scroll markets stirring at dawn, goats bleating, bread baking in clay ovens, smoke curling into a windless sky. The land was not rich, but it was patient. It taught its people how to endure, how to wait for the rain, how to bow to drought and carry on. Cyrus grew among such rhythms. Cradled by a world that did not rush, he played beside irrigation canals and learned the names of stones. His grandfather, a stern man with hands like weathered bark, taught him how to listen to the wind before it changed, how to see the shape of a falcon before it stooped. There was no crown waiting for him, only the weight of expectation not spoken, but understood. The elders saw something in him, not brilliance, but stillness. He asked few questions, but his eyes never stopped following. When he walked into a room, even the dogs paused to watch, and when he spoke, he did so like one listening to something far older than the present moment. He was not the strongest boy, nor the tallest, but people moved aside when he passed. It was as if the land itself leaned closer to him, whispering its secrets. As he grew, so did the boundaries of his world from garden to village, from village to road, from road to kingdom. He traveled with traders, sat among governors, watched how men lied and how women negotiated without raising their voices. He learned the value of salt, of silence, of knowing when not to speak, and slowly, without war, without banners, he began to gather what others tried to seize: trust, loyalty, stories. He did not conquer, he invited, he listened. The kings of old demanded obedience, but Cyrus offered something rarer, a kind of dignity that felt like sunlight through storm clouds. When he entered Media, it was not with fire, but with forgiveness. He did not burn cities. He spared them. He saw not enemies, but people waiting for someone who remembered their names. One by one, satraps turned, priests offered incense, soldiers lowered their swords, and behind them all, the common folk farmers, bakers, women hanging linens to dry felt something shift, not in policy, but in the air itself. It was the feeling of being seen, of being understood. In Babylon, when his armies came, the people did not resist. They opened the gates. They watched him walk beneath the towering archways of Ishtar and said to one another, "This one is different." He restored temples, freed captives, and returned gods to their altars. He wrote decrees that were more like prayers. His empire, like the mountains of his youth, did not rise all at once. It took time. It grew not through destruction, but through invitation. Cyrus, they would say, was a shepherd of men not because he led them, but because he found them where they were and walked beside them until they were ready to follow. In his presence, there was no thunder, only the quiet strength of stone warmed by sun. He built cities not for show, but for shelter. He named roads for their destinations, not for himself. His laws were brief. his punishments rare, his expectations clear. He did not erase cultures, he preserved them, and in doing so, his empire became not a monolith, but a mosaic each piece kept whole, each voice allowed to sing in its own tongue. In the gardens of Pasargadae, he planted trees from every corner of his realm, tamarind from the east, poplar from the west, pomegranate from the north, date palm from the south. He walked there in the evening, among the scent of jasmine and dust, his hands clasped behind him, his thoughts far beyond the horizon. Those who saw him in those moments said he didn't seem like a king, but like a man remembering something he had not yet lived. And perhaps he was. Perhaps he knew, deep in his bones, that the empire would grow vast and fragile, that others would come who ruled with fear, who forgot the garden and only remembered the sword. But Cyrus planted nonetheless. He built not only for himself, but for those he would never meet. He died as he had lived without spectacle, a wound in battle, a final breath beneath the open sky. His tomb was a simple structure, a stone house with a sloping roof, standing alone on the plain, no gold, no guards, only silence and the whispering grass. An inscription, now lost to time, was said to read, "Stranger, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus who founded the Persian Empire. Do not grudge me this bit of earth that covers my body. And though empires rise and fall, though sand reclaims marble and names fade into dust, the quiet dignity of those words endures. For Cyrus did not seek to be remembered as a conqueror, but as a man who made room for difference, for peace, for the flowering of 1,000 ways of life under a single sun, and perhaps, in the hush between night and dawn, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear him walking in the garden, pausing beneath the fig tree, whispering to the wind. It began, as many great things do, not with the echo of drums or the clash of steel, but with silence, the kind of silence that waits patiently just before the dew lifts from the grass. After Cyrus had passed beyond the veil of time, the world did not erupt in mourning nor panic. Instead, it paused, briefly, as though holding its breath, uncertain if the balance he had forged from chaos could endure without the warmth of his voice guiding it. Yet, from that stillness, something remarkable unfolded. The roots he had planted in policy, in mercy, in the quiet stitching together of peoples began to deepen. The empire, so carefully woven like the threads of a carpet under a patient weaver's hands, didn't unravel. It expanded, under the weightless gaze of the moon and the scorching stare of the sun. It unfurled across lands that had never known such unity. The successors of Cyrus, beginning with Cambyses, picked up the thread with a wary steadiness. Cambyses, fierce in his ambition, set his eyes westward toward Egypt, where the Nile coiled like a sleeping god. His journey across the desert was no triumphal parade, but a cruel endurance, dust choking men's throats, the sand blistering their feet, the heat pulling water from the bones like a silent thief. And yet, he succeeded. Memphis fell. The great temples of the Egyptians watched a new flag rise above them, not through desecration, but through the slow, inevitable advance of a machine already in motion. Still, it was Darius, the distant kinsman who rose after Cambyses' mysterious fall, who would truly shape the empire into something enduring. He was not a son of Cyrus, but he carried Cyrus's spirit in the structure of his mind, orderly, vast, and quietly relentless. Where Cyrus had moved like water, Darius moved like stone. He carved the empire with precision, assigning satraps like chess pieces, not to dominate, but to tend governors of provinces who knew their lands, spoke their tongues, understood their silences. No longer would control rely on proximity. Now it rested on trust, on communication, on the spine of an idea strong enough to travel great distances without bending. Darius built roads, not short tracks, but arteries that pulsed with the life of an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Indus. The royal road became a ribbon of breath between peoples who might never meet but still lived under the same sky. Messengers rode day and night, changing horses at outposts built with foresight, their hooves kicking up stories and judgments and grain records alike. A letter written in Susa might arrive in Lydia in days, not months. It was not just roads he built, it was memory. With each milestone and pillar, he etched the empire's presence into the land like a name written into a child's palm, meant to last, meant to guide. Bureaucracy, that word so dry in textbooks, in his hands became almost sacred. To keep order among dozens of languages, customs, currencies, and gods was not oppression, it was art. Clay tablets recorded everything: taxes, births, grain counts, debts, festivals, and through this lattice of detail, the empire breathed steadily, even softly. In the quiet corners of the realm, farmers in Bactria sowed wheat by the moon's cycle. Traders in Babylon spoke half a dozen tongues without thinking. Goldsmiths in Sardis stamped coins with lions' heads that found their way to Indian markets, exchanged for spices and silk, and all of them, from the noble to the nameless, walked beneath the same unseen roof, the vast, invisible canopy of Achaemenid rule. There were no mass conversions, no forced tongues. Instead, people were allowed to be. It was perhaps the empire's most radical idea that power did not require uniformity, only balance, that peace, if nurtured, could grow not through sameness, but through careful distinction. In this strange harmony, a goat herder in the hills of Armenia and a merchant sailing the Persian Gulf both belonged to something greater than themselves, though neither needed to change his prayer or his name. Darius also built Persepolis, not as a city of walls or weapons, but as a symbol. It rose slowly from the dust like a dream being remembered, stone by stone, each column a quiet thought made solid. Here, the empire was not just governed, it was celebrated. Delegations came bearing gifts: ivory, cloth dyed the color of midnight, scrolls, oils, mirrors, animals wrapped in velvet leashes. The court did not thunder, it shimmered. And in the spaces between those columns, in the flicker of torches and the sweep of silk, something remarkable happened. People from across the world stood beside one another, not as slaves or supplicants, but as guests. Of course, not everything was harmony. There were rebellions, betrayals, border tensions, but these were ripples, not waves. The core of the empire, its idea held firm, because it had been built not on fear, but on patience, not on fire, but on foundation. Darius knew this. He inscribed his victories on cliffs and stone tablets. Yes, but always with an undercurrent of caution, an understanding that to rule well was not to be loved or feared, but to be remembered for having kept balance when others might have slipped. Beneath him, the machinery of empire moved in silence, scribes copying laws, farmers rotating crops, builders planning aqueducts, the noise of daily life folded into a single rhythm that stretched from one horizon to the next. And in that rhythm, the Achaemenid Empire began to glow, not brightly, not with the blinding flash of sudden greatness, but with a slow, steady burn, like coals under ash, like stars that only reveal themselves when the world is still. They did not look like power at first, just long bands of packed earth or stone, winding between hills, stretching across deserts, vanishing into forests unassuming, quiet, sometimes barely distinguishable from the land itself. But these roads were the veins of an empire, breathing life into places that had once been strangers to one another. The royal road, most famous of them all, began in the old kingdom of Lydia and crossed plains, rivers, and mountains until it reached Susa, the beating heart of Persia. Over 2,500 kilometers of thought, effort, and trust, not a wall to divide, but a thread to tie, and along it, everything moved: words, grain, coins, horses, music, news of birth and rebellion. Gods carried in stories, and kings carried in rumor. Couriers traveled swiftly, switching horses at stations spaced just right, never stopping, riding through heat and snow, beneath stars and storms, their minds focused not on their own lives, but on the letter wrapped in oilskin under their cloaks. A message written at dawn in Sardis could arrive in Susa by the fourth sunset. This was more than impressive. It was astonishing. In a world where most people's lives never stretched beyond the neighboring village, these roads opened the world like a scroll. Traders followed their curves with carts of saffron and glass beads. Pilgrims walked them barefoot, offering prayers at shrines along the way. Farmers came with baskets of wheat. Soldiers marched with sandals wrapped in leather and dust in their mouths. And all along these roads were signs of care rest stations, wells, fire towers, wayposts with carved markers not grand, but enduring, built for usefulness, not for show. It was as if the empire had reached out its hands in all directions, not to grasp, but to gather. And the people came, some with fear, some with hope, most with both. The roads allowed Persia to see itself, to realize that it was not just a constellation of cities and kings, but a single, breathing entity made of thousands of towns, tens of thousands of voices, and millions of footsteps. In the early light, you might have seen an Assyrian merchant nodding to a Bactrian horse trader. At noon, perhaps a group of Ionian philosophers debating in the shade of a tamarisk tree. By evening, children from different provinces sharing dates around a fire. Their words a mixture of tongues, but their laughter universal. The roads made this possible, not just as a means of travel, but as a kind of faith, a belief that movement could bind what difference could not. And yet, they were not easy. The heat could crack lips and souls alike. Dust could choke even the strongest camels. Bandits lurked in some regions, and rain turned some stretches into mud so thick that wheels sank like stones. But the empire maintained them, always, because they understood that without these roads, their power was an illusion. The roads were not just for kings. They were for poets carrying new meters, for priests spreading holy flame, for messengers bringing mercy, and sometimes warning. They were the empire's whisper, carried across lands vast and unknown, making the unfamiliar familiar, the distant near. Along these roads also traveled memory. Songs of ancient heroes crossed rivers they'd never seen before. Recipes changed by spices never tasted in their homeland. Weddings took place between peoples who had once considered each other myth. Over time, a Lydian might speak a few words of Elamite, a Mede might wear Egyptian linen, a Persian might offer sacrifices to gods whose names came from the West. The roads carried more than goods. They carried change, and yet they did so gently, like a breeze picking up the scent of jasmine and carrying it through a city asleep. Along these same routes, satraps moved with their retinues, local governors, chosen not to oppress, but to understand. They brought back grain tallies, census counts, local customs, strange court cases to be judged by imperial law, and from the court came replies not always just, but always swift. The roads ensured that no village was truly forgotten, that the farthest outpost knew, if not the king's face, at least his reach. But there was more. Beneath the practical, these roads held something sacred. To walk them was to take part in something larger than oneself, to know that your footstep echoed others, from other lands, under other skies. There was something deeply human in that the shared dust, the same sun in different eyes. Some roads hugged rivers, others cut through stone valleys where echoes lingered. Some crossed bridges so ancient, even the oldest traveler couldn't say who laid the first stone. At night, campfires lined the routes like soft constellations on the earth, flickering gently under the stars. Old men told stories in low voices, women combed children's hair by firelight, animals shifted, sighed, slept, and in the morning, the journey continued eastward, westward, always onward. No one traveled all the roads, not even the king, but the knowledge that they were there open, watched over, real, gave shape to the very idea of empire. It turned the vastness from a threat into a promise, because the roads told you you were not alone. Somewhere, over the next hill or the next 100 hills, someone else was also walking, also living, also part of this wide and ancient breadth called Persia. And so the roads remained, long after kings fell, long after cities burned, even after the columns of Persepolis cracked and weeds grew between the stones. Some of those roads still lay hidden under layers of time waiting, like a pulse, like a memory, like a dream half remembered just before waking. He didn't rise like a flame, sudden and consuming, but like the steady light of a candle protected from the wind, precise, thoughtful, and slow to flicker. Darius, son of Hystaspes, came to the throne not by blood certainty but by resolve. And in that delicate ascent he shaped not only his rule but the very soul of the empire. Where others sought to conquer, he sought to arrange. Where others dreamed in gold and conquest, he dreamed in records, columns, and stone. His power was not loud. It lay in structure, in the invisible harmony of 1,000 lives coordinated across mountains, rivers, and deserts. Darius understood that to keep such a realm alive, it needed more than soldiers. It needed clarity. So, he wrote, not just with ink, but with chisel and hammer, pressing his will into stone that could outlast breath. The Bahistan inscription, carved into a cliffside for all to see and few to reach, was his declaration not of war, but of logic. A statement of lineage, yes, and legitimacy, but also of design. He recorded his victories, his rebellions quashed, his rivals subdued not as tales of glory, but as parts of a greater pattern. Rebellion rises, order responds, harmony returns. The languages on the rock, Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, mirrored the very soul of his empire, plural, layered, and interdependent. Darius was not afraid of difference. He embraced it, codified it, structured it into the bones of governance. Under his rule, provinces were arranged into satrapies, each with its own governor, its own accounting books, its own obligations, but all bound by common law and tribute. He did not micromanage. He distributed. Power was not hoarded. It was handed out like well-measured grain, enough to nourish, but never to revolt. There were royal inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, not feared as spies, but respected as guardians of fairness. They listened, they observed, they reported, and order held. Darius built a currency too, not just coins, but trust. The Daric, a golden standard stamped with the image of the king, became the language of markets across 3 continents. It shimmered in Persian bazaars, Egyptian temples, Indian ports, and Anatolian workshops. It bought silk, incense, olive oil, oxen, labor, and loyalty. Yet the coin was more than currency. It was a whisper that said, "You are part of something larger." Darius also gave law the dignity of permanence. He oversaw the refinement of existing legal codes, Babylonian, Median, Elamite, allowing each region its traditions, but within a lattice of imperial oversight. There was no desire to erase the past, only to guide it forward. Priests still lit their sacred flames, judges still wore their ancestral robes, but beneath it all was the quiet breath of unity, a common expectation of fairness, a shared belief that justice was possible. The empire, under Darius, was not a single melody, but a chorus not always in tune, but moving toward harmony. He trusted in people more than in force. Armies were kept, of course, and he knew how to wield them when needed, but his true weapon was consistency. A governor who overtaxed removed, a satrap who ignored the king's decrees replaced. The empire became predictable, and in that predictability, people thrived, trade blossomed, roads stayed safe, granaries filled. Darius also turned his eye to water, the softest of elements, yet the one that shapes stone. He ordered canals dug to connect the Nile to the Red Sea, an ancient precursor to dreams that would echo through millennia. He irrigated lands once thought barren. He respected water as both life and limit. Where it flowed, he encouraged settlement. Where it dried, he sent engineers. And through it all, he watched, not from a throne alone, but through reports, through travelers, through the letters etched in wet clay and dried by the sun. There is something deeply human in his governance, not divine right, not brutality, but the slow, imperfect work of tending. Darius tended the empire like a gardener pruning here, planting there, leaving space for growth. In Persepolis, he expanded what Cyrus had begun, a palace not only of stone, but of ideas. Its halls held carvings of peoples from across the realm, Scythians with bows, Libyans with oxen, Indians with ivory, Greeks with cloth. None were shown kneeling. They walked with dignity, bearing gifts, their faces carved with care, not mockery. It was a visual philosophy power, as hosting, not dominating. Darius welcomed the world into his court not to erase it, but to celebrate it. His vision was not of a uniform empire, but of a layered one, like the patterned tiles of a grand mosaic floor. In such a vision, contradiction was not a threat, but a feature. He ruled not by eliminating difference, but by giving it place, shape, and rhythm. There were struggles, of course. Rebellions rose in Egypt and Babylon. Murmurs grew in distant corners, and Darius answered them not with cruelty, but with resolve. He believed deeply in order, and for him, disorder was not just inconvenience. It was a fracture in the shared dream. He met it with swift repair. His justice could be severe, but never wanton. Punishment came with explanation, and more importantly, with a restoration of balance. Darius knew that empires did not collapse because of enemies outside. They crumbled from rot within, from confusion, neglect, inequality, and so he labored to make the empire transparent, comprehensible, and fair. His achievements were not thrilling, but they endured. People did not weep when he passed. They nodded, because under his watch, the fields had grown, the roads had stayed open, the markets had trusted the weights on the scales. His greatness was quiet. Like the slow accumulation of soil that makes a plain fertile, Darius did not promise paradise. He promised structure, and in that structure, people found peace. Today, fragments of his inscription still cling to cliffs, worn by wind, faded by time, but their voice is still clear, not a shout, not a command, just the steady, enduring breath of a man who saw the world not as chaos to conquer, but as a garden to cultivate with patience, with clarity, and above all, with care. It did not rise like a fortress, nor sprawl like a city hungering for land. Persepolis rose like a thought patient, clear and still, not a place of battle or of birth, but of gathering, of presence, of reflection, high above the plain, where the wind moved slowly and the sun carved long shadows across the stone. The great terrace began to take shape. Workers came from across the empire, speaking in tongues that curled like smoke around the scaffolded walls. Egyptians brought their knowledge of stone and symmetry, Ionian artisans their eye for proportion, Babylonians their wisdom in brick and mortar. It was not a monument built by one people for one king, but a hushed collaboration, like a shared prayer whispered across languages, and in time, it became something that looked less like a palace and more like a dream turned solid. The stairs were broad, gentle in ascent, designed not to rush the visitor, but to slow the pace as if each step were an invitation to quiet the mind. At the top, the gate of all nations stood, vast and silent, flanked by guardian bulls whose eyes didn't threaten but watched. They were carved with precision, their forms both beast and god, but their presence was not cruel. It was calm. It told all who entered, you are seen, and still, you may pass. Inside, halls opened like chambers of thought. The Apadana, with its 72 columns, held a ceiling so high it seemed to disappear into the morning mist. Light filtered through in soft ribbons. Shadows of pillars moved slowly across the floor as the sun turned, hour by hour, and in their movement, time itself seemed to breathe. Along the reliefs, the walls did not shout of conquest, but spoke in symbols of inclusion. Here was a procession of people's Medes in their soft robes, Elamites with twisted beards, Armenians bearing horses, Nubians with ivory tusks. They came not bowed, but upright, bearing gifts, not tribute. Their eyes were carved with care, their garments detailed with loving attention, their hands not bound, but offering, each one unique, each one part of the whole. And in this silent march of stone, a message endured. Strength was not sameness, but harmony. Power was not in crushing, but in convening. There were no loud colors, no gaudy jewels embedded in walls. The beauty of Persepolis was in its restraint, in the whisper of stone on sandal, in the stillness between footfalls on marble floors. Even the throne room, with all its space and height, seemed less like a place for issuing commands, and more like a space for listening. There were no barracks here, no armories. This was not a fortress. It was a space of presence, and in its quiet, it carried the weight of an idea that rule could be a form of invitation. In spring, when the snows melted and the earth breathed green again, kings would hold court here. Delegations arrived weeks in advance, carrying spices wrapped in cloth, scrolls sealed with wax, animals with bells tied to their necks. They camped in the fields, lit fires, shared songs under the stars, and then, dressed in their finest silks, linens, furs, they would climb the great stair and enter a hall that held the breath of centuries. The court did not erupt with noise. It absorbed sound, a place where voices were lowered, where the echo of one word might stretch like a thread between nations. Here, decisions were not barked, but considered. Justice was not wielded, but offered. And always, there was time. That was the secret of Persepolis. It did not rush. It asked its visitors to slow, to feel the stone underfoot, the weight of air between columns, the presence of those who had come before. Even the winds moved gently here, as if mindful of what the place held. At night, the halls emptied but didn't sleep. Moonlight fell through archways, casting the reliefs in silver and blue. Owls nested in the eaves. Guards stood silently, their shadows long and unblinking. Somewhere, far off, a flute played not for ceremony, not for command, but for no reason at all. Just music, offered to the night. During festival times, the city below filled with color, lanterns swayed in the wind, spices turned in hot pans, children ran barefoot through the streets chasing one another with fig leaves. But on the terrace, quiet held. It was not aloofness, it was reverence. The understanding that this place, unlike others, was not for daily life, but for remembering what life could mean when elevated by thought and care. The stone was warm by midday, cool at dawn. Rain darkened it, sun bleached it, but it endured. Not just the stone itself, but what it had been shaped to hold. A kind of presence, a stillness that made even a traveler from the farthest satrapy stop and feel something he could not quite name. That feeling of being in the presence of something larger, older, gentler was what Persepolis gave. Darius had dreamed it. Xerxes expanded it. Artaxerxes added to it. And with each layer, the vision deepened. A city that didn't conquer but welcomed. A space that did not command but invited. In its corridors, a satrap might walk beside a scholar, a priest might nod to a general, a merchant might admire the same sculpture as a prince, and for a moment, all titles slipped away, and there remained only a shared gaze upon a carved face, a quiet breath between words, the knowledge that each person stood not alone, but within something whole. That was the true architecture of Persepolis. Not the stone, not the columns, not the layout of the halls, but the feeling it stirred, a memory of unity, a promise of grace. And though fire would one day come sudden, angry, blind, and though its columns would fall, its treasures melt, its stories scatter to the wind, still that presence would linger, in the dust, in the broken carvings, in the silent symmetry of what remained. The soul of Persepolis could not burn. It had never been made of stone. There was a scent in the air, one that could not be traced to a single flower or spice, but to the mingling of many saffron from distant hills, cardamom from wet southern markets, the sweet, sharp smoke of cedarwood incense from Lebanon, all threading together like a song of the empire. The Achaemenid realm, as it spread, did not press its voice over others. It listened, it collected, it invited. In the great courts and shaded gardens of Susa, Ecbatana, and Persepolis, the world came together not as conquered and conqueror, but as neighbors at a long and low table. There was no single face to the empire, no one tongue that echoed louder than the others. Instead, there were many Aramaic scribes bending over clay, Egyptian priests singing beneath linen canopies, Lydian musicians plucking strings tuned to scales unfamiliar in the East. Each language, each rhythm, each flavor became part of a shared feast, and at its heart sat not one identity, but many, layered like the woven cloths traded along the royal road. One might walk through the marketplace of Sardis and hear 10 dialects before the sun reached its highest point. The shopkeepers did not raise eyebrows at foreign words they learned them, shaped their mouths around them, laughed through misunderstandings, and traded just the same. A Persian caravan master could barter with a Phoenician sailor in gestures and half phrases, while nearby a Zoroastrian priest debated the nature of fire with a visiting Brahmin under the shade of a tamarisk. Culture flowed like water, seeping into every crevice, making its home in unexpected corners. A Median woman might wear Greek jewelry. A Babylonian boy might write his prayers in Persian script. An Elamite baker might hum an old Assyrian lullaby while kneading dough before dawn. Nothing was erased. Everything was absorbed. In the kitchens of noble houses, cooks from every corner of the empire worked together, stewing lentils with pomegranate seeds, roasting lamb in date syrup, baking flatbreads on iron plates as old songs floated out the open window. The food became a language of its own, understood by all, cherished by all, and changing with each new visitor who shared a recipe or a memory. It was not only cuisine, it was belief. The Achaemenids, perhaps unlike many empires before or after, didn't command one god, one ritual, one truth. They watched, they allowed. In temples across the realm, sacred fires burned beside carved idols. Prayers were whispered in tombs and shouted from towers. Rites took place in dark sanctuaries and open fields. In some places, gods had animal heads. In others, they were pure flame. Some demanded blood, others silence. All were permitted so long as they did not threaten the peace. That peace, after all, was the real deity of the empire, and it was guarded not by swords, but by tolerance. Darius himself made offerings in temples foreign to his birth. Xerxes consulted oracles older than Persia itself. The rulers understood something timeless, that people will defend what they are allowed to love. And so, they allowed. And the people loved their gods, their customs, their songs, their neighbors. It was imperfect, of course. Tensions rose, borders frayed, but within the broad canvas of the empire, the brushstrokes remained diverse and vibrant. In the palaces, scribes transcribed messages in 3 or 4 scripts. The language of administration might be Old Persian, but the language of business, Aramaic. On festival days, poems were recited in languages the king himself did not speak, but he listened all the same, and the court fell silent in respect. Culture was not ornamental here, it was essential. The empire's strength didn't lie in the uniformity of its banners, but in the multitude of colors they bore. At night, in the gardens of Persepolis, poets would gather beneath oil lamps swaying in the wind. One might chant verses from the Avesta, another would respond with a story from the Nile, a third might speak of the stars in the tongue of the Indus. Their words drifted like mist over the flower beds, blending with the rustle of leaves, the low hum of insects, the distant trickle of water from a fountain carved by a sculptor whose name had long been forgotten, but whose hand still whispered in every curve of stone. Children grew up hearing not only their mother's lullabies, but those of the neighbor's neighbor, an Egyptian song here, a Scythian tale there. They learned to count in multiple ways, to bless in different names, to bow or touch the heart or raise the hand depending on who they greeted. And none of it seemed strange. It was life. It was what the empire had become, a feast of identities, richly spiced, gently simmered, never rushed. Even the clothes people wore became blended. Persian robes cut in Greek style, Median caps worn with Phoenician sandals, jewelry mixing motifs from Mesopotamian temples and Anatolian hills. Fashion did not follow law. It followed curiosity, and art followed suit. Reliefs showed animals from far-off lands, elephants, lions, mythical creatures with wings and hooves, feathered gods with human eyes. Music carried instruments with names from a dozen languages, played in rhythms that danced between regions, and in the heart of it all was a strange, warm stillness, the kind that settles over a gathering when the food is good, the guests at ease, and the night deep enough to forget tomorrow. It was the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, but is felt in the way people walk, in the way they linger after conversation, in the way they pass down stories without worrying about who first told them. That was the genius of the Persian Empire, not in battle, not in wealth, but in the ability to hold so much difference without breaking, to let culture flourish like a garden where no flower was told how to bloom. And though centuries would pass, and wars would come, and many would try to draw lines where none had been before, still the memory of that feast lingers, in the spices that cross borders, in the prayers that blend names, in the stories that sound familiar even in foreign tongues. The empire is gone, but the taste remains. Long before the empire found its shape in stone and law, long before satraps were named and roads stitched the world together, there was a fire. It burned not in temples of grandeur or in halls of state, but in modest hearths and sacred groves, tended by hands more faithful than ambitious. This fire did not roar. It breathed a soft, steady flame that refused to die, even as winds rose and centuries turned. The prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra as some would call him, did not thunder when he spoke. He was not a king, nor a general, nor a builder of cities. He was a listener to the wind, to the stars, to the silence between thoughts. Born among the early Iranians, his life was shaped by mountains, by the slant of sun over snow, by the quiet endurance of flocks grazing on sparse grass. And in that quiet, he began to see with an inner eye not visions of conquest, but of clarity. The world, he taught, wasn't chaos wrapped in divine whim, but a field of choice. Each moment, each breath, was a turning a path toward truth or falsehood, toward light or shadow. The flame he preached of was not merely physical. It was a symbol, a mirror of the inner fire, the spark of thought and conscience that distinguished the just from the wicked. In a time of many gods, Zoroaster spoke of one Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, not a tyrant of thunder, but a creator of order and light. Around him, people listened, not all, and not quickly, but enough. The idea took root, quietly, like a seed in winter. And when the kings of Persia rose, they did not cast this teaching aside. They welcomed it, not as law, but as light. The Achaemenids did not impose Zoroastrianism, but they were shaped by it, by its ethics, its emphasis on truth, its reverence for purity, its trust in the dignity of choice. Darius, who carved his victories into cliffs, also carved his prayers. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, he wrote, "I am king, not by might, not by birth, but by the grace of a wisdom that demanded responsibility, not entitlement." And so the flame burned in state temples, in rural shrines, in the quiet sanctuaries of travelers far from home. Priests tended it in silence, feeding it with dry wood, shielding it from wind, watching it flicker and leap in patterns only they could read. But this fire was not jealous. It did not demand destruction of other faiths. Zoroaster's wisdom was not a sword. It was a mirror. The fire burned beside the idols of Babylon, within sight of the Egyptian sun God's obelisks, across hills where other prayers floated into the sky. And yet, its influence deepened, not loudly, but steadily. Zoroastrianism's ethics spread through custom. To lie was a sin. To keep one's word sacred, cleanliness became more than hygiene. It became a devotion. Purity of thought, of speech, of action, these were not abstract ideals, but lived practices. In courtrooms, truth became more than advantage. In contracts, the word became binding. The duality of existence, Asha and Druj, order and deceit, shaped the way Persians saw not just theology, but governance, justice, and everyday living. It was not an empire of blind obedience, but of conscious balance. To serve the king was good if the king served truth. To obey the law was right if the law served justice. And over time, these beliefs infused the very architecture of rule. Temples stood open to the sky, their fires reflecting the stars. Rituals unfolded with care, the washing of hands, the tying of sacred cords, the reciting of verses that curled like smoke into the heavens. And even those who followed other gods often adopted these rhythms, as if the quiet dignity of the practice itself drew reverence. Zoroastrian priests, the Magi, did not wage war. They read omens in the flight of birds, guided rulers in times of doubt, and maintained the rituals that tethered the empire not only to heaven, but to itself. At night, when most of the world slept, they stood watch by the flame, whispering ancient prayers that reminded the fire of its task to burn, to illuminate, to remain. Children were taught not only to read and count, but to speak truth and clean their hands before prayer. Farmers greeted the dawn with offerings of milk and grain, not out of fear, but gratitude. The very idea of empire, once a brute instrument of control, became under Zoroastrian influence a stage for virtue, a chance to align human order with cosmic order. Ahura Mazda was not pleased by conquest, but by justice, not by monuments, but by honest work. And so, kings were judged not by their victories, but by how closely they walked the path of righteousness. That path was narrow, always shifting, but the flame lit it not far ahead, just enough for the next careful step. Even the burial customs reflected this balance. The dead were not burned or buried, lest they pollute fire or earth. Instead, they were laid to rest in open towers, exposed to sky and scavenger, returning to the cycle without corruption. Life was not possession, it was stewardship, and death, not an end, but a returning. In this worldview, there was no hellfire, no eternal torment. There was error, and there was the possibility of correction. There was darkness, and there was the duty to kindle light. And in the empire's heartbeat, in its laws, its ceremonies, its unspoken expectations, this ethic pulsed gently. Not all were Zoroastrians, but all lived in its glow. Over centuries, that fire would move through time, through trade, through diaspora. It would touch Rome, influence Christianity and Islam in echoes scholars would later trace, but in these early days, it simply burned steady, unthreatening, firm, a symbol of a people who chose, every day, to tend rather than to destroy, to hold light gently, knowing it could guide or burn, to speak truth not for reward, but because it was truth. And though empires fall and temples crumble, fire needs little to survive. A spark, a breath, a memory. In that memory, Zoroaster still speaks, not with volume, but with clarity, not from thrones, but from the flame that flickers quietly in places the world forgets to look. It came not with rage, but with distance, the long breath between two worlds learning of each other's shape. To the west of the empire, beyond the shifting sands of Anatolia and the tall mountains that shrugged off summer, the Aegean shimmered like a mirror laid at the edge of the known world. And across that mirror stood the Greeks, restless, quarrelsome, lovers of argument and beauty. Their cities built on cliffs and cradled by olive groves. They were not united, not in flag or rule, but in spirit. And it was that spirit which one day crossed the sea, brushing lightly against the edges of Persian peace. At first, it was not war. It was misunderstanding, then pride, then injury. The Ionian cities, once content under Persian satraps, stirred with ideas carried on salty breezes from Athens. The Greeks saw in Persia a vastness they could not comprehend, and Persia saw in the Greeks a defiance too small to worry over until the defiance lit fires in cities and threw off satrap chains. Darius heard of it not as a cry, but as a whisper brought through messengers, the kind that lowers its voice when approaching a king. The cities had rebelled, not many, not great, but the act echoed, as small things sometimes do. And so the king responded not with fury, but with method. Ships were summoned, generals appointed. A campaign was planned not as vengeance, but as a restoration of balance. When the Persian army marched westward, it did so not like a storm, but like a tide, slow, wide. Sure, the soldiers wore many colors. Some bore curved swords, others straight. Camels and horses moved beside one another. From behind curtains, poets wrote of order returning, and yet, in the narrow plains of Marathon, the tide met stone. The Greeks, fewer in number, stood fast. They fought not for empire, but for the idea that a man should speak for himself. It was a brief clash, a morning's breath of blood and dust, but it was enough. The Persians withdrew, not defeated in pride, but checked in surprise. Darius did not live to return. His son, Xerxes, inherited not only a crown, but the shadow of Greece. And shadows, when ignored, grow long. Xerxes, taller than most, sharp-eyed and restless, chose not to wait. His campaign was not a gesture, it was a wave. Bridges of boats spanned the Hellespont. Soldiers crossed in the tens of thousands. The empire moved as one vast body, and the Greeks, fractured and fiery, gathered with the desperation of islands facing a flood. Thermopylae became legend, few against many. courage against certainty. The Spartans did not expect to win. They expected to mean something, and they did. The narrow pass slowed the wave, and in doing so, gave it pause. Further south, at Salamis, the tide turned. Persian ships, heavy with ambition, found themselves choked in the narrow throats of the sea. Greek triremes darted like fish with teeth, cutting and retreating, dancing and destroying. Xerxes watched from a golden throne atop a cliff, his face unreadable, the sea below boiling with fire and wreckage. He left soon after, leaving a general behind to finish what he had begun. But something had shifted. The empire, so vast, had learned its limit, not in geography, but in will. The Greeks would not be absorbed. They were too divided to conquer, too proud to surrender. And Persia, wise in many things, saw that to push further was to lose the balance it had so carefully maintained. So, the war softened, not with treaties, not with parades, but with the slow erosion of interest. The Greeks returned to their disputes, the Persians to their gardens, yet the meeting left marks. Ideas crossed the sea even when armies could not. Persian garments appeared in Athenian markets. Greek sculpture found its way into palace niches. Philosophers read Persian maxims, and Persian scribes copied Hellenic poems. The clash had been brief, but the contact endured, and beneath the surface, admiration bloomed in strange places. Greeks whispered of Persian discipline, of their king's justice, of cities laid out in perfect lines. Persians spoke of Greek courage, of their gods who dared to question, of their thinkers who claimed no throne but commanded thought. There was no treaty, no peace carved into stone, but there was understanding, a mutual gaze that said, "You are not me, and yet I see you." In time, Alexander would come a storm of ambition cloaked in youth, carrying Homer in one hand and fire in the other. But for now, the empires stood apart, each tending its own flame, and in the quiet, the memory of the clash remained not as a wound, but as a wrinkle in the fabric of history. It had not unraveled the Persian tapestry. It had not conquered the empire, but it had shown that even the mightiest must sometimes bow to the limits of will, to the courage of the small, to the strange strength of the human spirit when pressed against fate. And so the fire continued to burn, the roads continued to hum, the scribes continued to write, and the empire, vast, aware, and gently wounded, learned to carry its quiet scars with grace. He inherited the throne not with joy, but with the long, echoing silence that follows a father's death, a silence filled not with mourning alone, but with expectation, with shadows that stretched far beyond the palace walls. Xerxes, son of Darius, stood tall among courtiers, draped in robes woven with gold threads, his face composed yet distant, like a man hearing a melody others could not. The court whispered his name with reverence, but also with caution. He was not Cyrus, not Darius. He did not emerge from war, nor carve laws from chaos. He came into a world already balanced on the blade of perfection, and what he inherited was not just power, but pressure. The empire was at its peak, a garden carefully pruned, a road system vast and humming, satrapies orderly, tribute flowing. It was a creation of stone and parchment, of ancient prayers and fresh ink. And yet, at the edge of it all, in the west, where the sun turned the sea to fire, Greece still flickered unresolved, unfinished. Darius had died with Greece still defiant, and Xerxes felt that silence like a thorn beneath the silk. Advisors counseled caution, generals recounted the losses, scribes read omens from cracked bones and flightless birds. But Xerxes, young yet already heavy with inheritance, chose to answer his father's ghost with thunder. He raised the largest army the empire had ever seen, not in haste, but with solemnity. Every province contributed horsemen from Bactria, archers from Assyria, spearmen from Sogdia, camels from Arabia, chariots from Lydia. The roads shook with movement, and markets swelled with supply. Bridges were laid across rivers, food was rationed and stored, and when the march began, it was like watching the mountains move. The army crossed the Hellespont on floating pontoons, ships lashed together into a trembling spine of ambition. Xerxes walked across not as a man, but as a god in the eyes of his men, tall, radiant, burdened with destiny. The sea, though, did not bow. A storm came. It ripped the bridges apart like paper. Xerxes, furious, ordered the waves whipped, chained, cursed. The moment echoed a king commanding the elements, as if forgetting that even kings are made of flesh. But he rebuilt the bridges. The army crossed, and Greece trembled. The battles came like verses in a long, tragic poem. At Thermopylae, Persian might was delayed by Spartan resolve, a tale that would outlive both victor and vanquished. At Salamis, the sea turned against them, narrow straits favoring nimble Greek ships over the proud, wide vessels of Persia. Xerxes, watching from a throne atop a rocky rise, saw his fleet splinter like glass under wind. He did not weep. Not then. He returned to Persia, leaving his general to continue a war that had already begun to feel unwinnable. The loss was not total. The empire did not fall, but something shifted, a softness beneath the surface, a quiet loosening of the tightly pulled thread that held everything together. Xerxes returned to Persepolis, to Susa, to the world he knew, but the weight he carried had grown heavier. The court remained beautiful. The gardens still bloomed. The road still carried silk and cedar and whispers, yet within the polished marble and silver bowls, there was a hush that hadn't been there before, the hush of disappointment, the kind that does not speak but watches. Xerxes turned inward. He began to build not just palaces, but spaces of solitude, rooms for thought, corridors that opened to quiet pools. He hosted festivals, yes, received envoys, yes, but his gaze often drifted. He became, over time, a man seated beside memory. The fire temples burned as they always had. The scribes inked their records. The people lived and died and lived again. But the king moved through it all like a shadow in daylight. It was not shame that consumed him, but disillusionment. The realization that empire, however vast, could not shape the will of a people who did not wish to be shaped. That a throne, no matter how gilded, could not quiet the sea. And so, he withdrew not from duty, but from desire. He ruled, still issued laws, appointed governors, oversaw harvests, but his hand, once firm, became gentle. His voice, once loud, grew low. The king, who had tried to command the wind, now listened to it. And in that listening, the empire changed. Not crumbled, not yet, but softened. The satraps grew more independent. The tribute arrived more slowly. Roads, still traveled, began to wear at the edges. Cities, still loyal, whispered of their own greatness. Xerxes did not strike them down. He allowed them space. Perhaps he thought this tolerant strength. Perhaps he simply tired of force. In the quiet corners of his palace, poets recited old stories. Dancers performed beneath lanterns shaped like stars. Musicians played lutes carved from walnut wood, their melodies rising like smoke into the domes above. And always, the king watched a man still seated on the highest seat, but no longer reaching. When he died, there was no thunder. No wars broke at once. No statues were torn down. Only a sigh, deep and slow, like the exhale of stone after centuries of standing tall. The empire went on, as empires do. But those who remembered him truly remembered didn't speak of his failures in battle. They spoke of his silence, of how, in the end, he ruled not by ambition, but by awareness. How he looked into the sea and saw not an enemy, but a mirror. How he bore the weight of greatness, then let it rest beside him like a folded robe. And how the empire, vast and many-tongued, wept not with wailing, but with stillness, the kind that honors a king who tried to shape the world, and then chose to understand it instead. In a world as wide as the Persian Empire, where snow rested on the mountains of Armenia, while monsoons soaked the Indus Valley, no single voice could govern all. The empire did not stretch like a chain pulled taut, but like a tapestry vast, intricate, resilient only because of the gentle looseness in its weave. At the heart of this quiet strength were the satraps, governors, yes, but more than that, they were the empire's listeners, its mediators, its silent architects of continuity. Darius had crafted the system with precision, dividing the empire into provinces not by whim, but by understanding by terrain, by culture, by ancient lines of loyalty and language. Each satrapy had its own character, its own pace of life, its own song sung at dusk, and the satrap, appointed not only for power but for knowledge of the place, was trusted not to enforce sameness, but to nurture difference. It was a radical idea for its time that control could be soft, that obedience could arise not from fear but from respect. A satrap did not rule with a sword drawn, but with a pen ready, an ear tuned, a hand outstretched. In Lydia, the satrap spoke Greek in the marketplace and Persian at court. In Egypt, he walked barefoot into temples, honoring gods with faces unfamiliar to his own people. In Bactria, he rode on horseback among herdsmen, hearing grievances before they became resentments. They collected tribute, yes, silver, grain, soldiers, wine, but they also protected. Their guards kept bandits off the roads. Their scribes recorded land disputes. Their judges settled quarrels in the language of the region. They did not erase the local. They upheld it. And in doing so, they made the empire something that could stretch without breaking. At court, there were reports, monthly, sometimes more, grain tallies, tax ledgers, updates on births and festivals, and omens seen in the stars. And the king, whether Darius, Xerxes, or those who followed, did not bark orders in reply. He sent back letters brief, deliberate, written with an ink that understood both distance and trust. The satraps, in turn, became almost like kings in their provinces, but kings who bowed, kings who remembered that their throne was borrowed, their power conditional. That delicate balance of autonomy and allegiance was the soul of the empire's endurance. It allowed the heart of Persia to beat softly through 1,000 different bodies. In some places, people swore oaths by fire. In others, by river or mountain, or the name of an ancestor buried deep. All were accepted, all were recognized. The satrap did not come to convert, but to connect. And the people, though aware of their place in a vast empire, did not feel lost within it. They saw their customs respected, their temples left standing, their gods given space. They paid taxes, yes, but not their identity. There was, of course, the risk of overreach. Some satraps grew bold, a few hoarded wealth, raised armies beyond what was permitted, flirted with rebellion, and when they did, the empire responded not always gently. Armies moved, palaces were seized, heads rolled, though rarely in public. But such responses were measured, precise. They didn't send a message of fear, but of boundaries. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, and so it was prized. In peaceful years, the satrap was a bridge between the king and the people. In troubled years, he was the dam holding back flood. His loyalty mattered, but so did his gentleness. The empire didn't last through iron alone. It lasted because its governors understood the art of letting be, of letting people worship in their way, plant their fields according to the old calendar, dance their old dances beneath the same moon that watched over Persepolis. It was not indifference. It was respect, a deep, almost spiritual belief that the empire was not weakened by difference, but strengthened by it. The satraps met each year, or when summoned, to report, to celebrate festivals, to reaffirm their connection to the king. They brought gifts from their provinces, honeycombs from the Zagros, carpets woven in Anatolia, horses bred on the Caspian plains. These were not mere offerings. They were stories, tokens of loyalty. Yes, but also of identity. The king accepted them not as tribute to his greatness, but as symbols of the empire's living, breathing diversity. In the halls of Persepolis, these gifts were displayed with care, each labeled in 3 scripts, each placed with a quiet pride. Children of noble houses were often sent to live in the court of the king, not as hostages, but as threads in the weave of unity. They learned Persian, learned the customs of the court, and returned home fluent not only in language, but in a feeling of belonging to something larger. The satraps, too, traveled when they could, attending royal weddings, funerals, New Year ceremonies. They bowed, they feasted, they spoke with one another. They saw themselves not as rivals, but as parts of a whole. And as they returned to their provinces, they carried with them not just orders, but a sense of shared stewardship. In winter, they distributed food from granaries. In summer, they oversaw the cleaning of canals. When floods came, they were there. When rebellion sparked, they knew where and why, not because they spied, but because they listened. Their power was quiet, their loyalty often unspoken, but it held the empire like thread holds cloth. And in the end, when the storms of history rose, when invaders came, when cities fell, when the center trembled, it was the satraps who stood longest. Not all, but many. They held their provinces with dignity. They protected the temples, preserved the archives, fed the people. They did not save the empire, but they kept its memory alive, because they had lived it not as a distant idea, but as a daily practice, to rule gently, to hold space, to listen, to let be, and in that, perhaps, lay the deepest wisdom of Persia, that the most enduring power is not the one that bends all to its will, but the one that allows the many to grow, together, beneath the quiet shelter of a single, watchful sky. There's a silence that falls over the earth in the early morning, just before the first bird speaks, when the dew still holds the shape of the night. It was in that hush, before the empire's temples opened their doors and the market stirred with scent and sound, that Persian life most deeply breathed, not in war, not in courtly proclamation, but in the steady rituals of living. The garden, to the Persians, was not an ornament. It was a mirror of order, a vision of the world as it should be measured, flourishing, generous with its shade. They called it paradisa, a word that would one day echo as paradise in other tongues, but which in its root simply meant a walled space, enclosed, protected, beloved. These gardens were more than beautiful. They were designed with water channels carved to precise geometry, trees planted not at random but in deliberate harmony, paths curved not for grandeur, but for rhythm, the sound of running water, the rustle of leaves, the bloom of flowers timed to the seasons. This was the empire in miniature, a living diagram of balance and intention. In such a space, a traveler might pause to drink from a cool basin, a poet might lean beneath a fig tree, lost in a verse, a satrap might stroll beside his daughter, naming the stars as they appeared, one by one, in the growing dusk. Outside the gardens, the land fed more than thought. Granaries dotted the countryside like great lungs of grain, breathing in the harvest, breathing out sustenance across the empire. Their design was subtle, some dug deep into the earth, cool and dark, others raised above it, sealed against moisture and pest. The grain inside was not hoarded, it was distributed, tracked by scribes with the reed pens and clay tablets. Wheat, barley, millet, lentils measured not only by weight, but by timing. A surplus meant security, a deficit meant planning. In good years, the people ate well bread baked in clay ovens, flat and warm, sweetened with dates or spread with soft cheese. In leaner times, the grain from the royal stores came forth, not as charity, but as duty. No one starved while the empire still held breath. Farmers understood their land with a kind of reverence. They tilled with care, irrigated with wisdom handed down from fathers who'd learned it by watching the clouds, the soil, the birds. They rotated crops, knowing which roots replenished the earth, which drained it. They sowed by moonlight when needed, and in the evenings, they looked to the sky not for escape, but for guidance. For the Persians, the stars were not distant fire, but companions. From the shepherd in the hills to the priest in the temple, they read the heavens as one might read an ancient book, slowly, carefully, humbly. Astronomy was no idle curiosity. It was study, it was planning. The rising of certain stars signaled planting. The disappearance of others marked the new year, and the new year Nowruz was a celebration not of empire, but of renewal. It came at the spring equinox, when light and dark held equal sway, and the earth poised between them like a dancer holding her breath. In every home, fires were lit, houses were cleaned, tables were set with symbols: water, fruit, mirrors, eggs, herbs. Families gathered, not to feast on power, but to feast on the memory of beginnings. Children were told stories of creation, of light emerging from shadow, of Ahura Mazda shaping the world not with violence, but with intention. And in those stories, the people heard echoes of their own lives: quiet labor rewarded, balance restored, truth chosen. In the cities, craftsmen shaped silver into goblets, etched with vines and lions. Weavers dyed wool with indigo and madder, creating carpets that seemed to breathe underfoot. Builders carved doorways that invited light just so, allowing morning to fall across a room in a perfect diagonal. And in the spaces between work and worship, people told stories, not grand epics always, but small tales of a bird who returned each spring to the same tree, of a boy who could speak with goats, of a girl whose laughter healed her grandmother's knees. These stories lived in the air, passed from lips to ears, sometimes written, often just remembered. The empire was not only ruled by kings, it was ruled by memory, the memory of how to plant, how to greet, how to mourn. Funeral rites were simple but profound. The body was washed, dressed, laid to rest according to ancient practice. Mourning was not a spectacle, it was a silence, a meal shared, a candle lit. Life was honored not in death's drama, but in the quiet continuation of what came after. And amid all this, the gardens, the grain, the stars, the songs, there was something deeper still, a rhythm, the pulse of an empire that did not demand spectacle, but thrived on constancy. Children learned by imitation. Elders were not retired, but revered. Decisions took time. Agreements were sealed not only with ink, but with the shared presence of witnesses, sometimes seated under a tree, drinking tea that had cooled and still been finished. There were no clocks. There was time. And with time, trust. Traders crossed the empire with satchels of silk, jars of honey, coils of tin. They stopped in villages, told jokes, sang songs they'd heard in cities no one else in town had seen. They brought with them more than goods, they brought the world. And the people received it not with suspicion, but with the slow smile of curiosity. What is that fruit? What do you call that stringed instrument? Why does your prayer end with fire, and mine with salt? And the answers, given with kindness, planted new seeds. The empire bloomed not through conquest alone, but through this the steady grafting of wonder into familiarity. So while kings carved laws and generals mapped borders, it was the gardens, the granaries, and the stars that held Persia together. The roots were deeper than palaces, the people's rhythm stronger than any single ruler's will. And in the soft light of dawn, as the sky blushed with the first sighs of day, a woman might water her garden, a man might kneel to examine a sprouting stalk, a child might point to a fading star, asking what it means, and all of them, though unaware, would be holding the empire in place not with force, but with care. It did not crumble with fire. It did not scream. Babylon, the city of stars and towers, fell with a sigh so soft that the night itself might have missed it. For generations, its ziggurats had clawed at the sky, its priests walked in shadowed processions, its canals had mirrored the moon. It was a city older than most memories, a place of stories in stone, of gods carved in lion shapes and tablets pressed with words older than empires. And yet, when Persia came, it didn't come with siege towers. It came with silence. Cyrus, the king who knew how to conquer by listening, approached not as a destroyer, but as a reader of the soul. Babylon was weary. Its people had grown tired of kings who had forgotten them, tired of offerings made not to gods but to thrones, tired of a rule that spoke in commands but not in care. Cyrus understood this. He did not need to break the walls. He walked through gates that opened for him, greeted not by resistance but by relief. The priest welcomed him. The people cheered, cautiously at first, then with honest ease. He didn't burn the temples. He bowed in them. He didn't erase their gods. He let them speak. In his decree, written in cuneiform and placed gently into history, he spoke not of victory, but of restoration, of returning captives to their homes, of giving back what had been taken, of letting worship rise again like smoke at dawn. The famed cylinder that bore his words spoke not like a conqueror, but like a steward. It promised peace, it promised order, and the city listened. In the streets of Babylon, children still played among the market stalls. Old men still debated the stars. Women still ground flour beneath frescoes of winged bulls. Life did not stop. It simply shifted, like a river finding a smoother bend. The Persians brought their language, yes, but they also adopted the tongues around them. They brought their scribes, their satraps, but left the city's rhythms intact. The gods of Babylon, Marduk, Ishtar, Nabu were not mocked or replaced. They were left standing, their temples washed and swept, their names spoken with the same reverence as before. It was this that made the fall so strange, not that it was bloodless, but that it was gentle, almost invisible. Babylon had known conquerors. It had tasted the iron of Assyria, the flame of rebellion, the whip of drought. But with Cyrus came something it had forgotten: respect. A respect not declared, but enacted in the way his soldiers did not loot, in the way his officials listened, in the way the city's customs were folded gently into the wider cloak of the empire. The merchants adapted, the priests adjusted, the scribes continued to press their styluses into clay, now recording not the edicts of Babylonian kings, but those of the Persian court. And yet, in the shape of the letters, in the flow of the language, nothing essential was lost, only added to. Time passed, and the city breathed beneath new banners. The canals were cleaned, trade expanded, the libraries remained open. But even as life continued, something began to fade, not in anger, but in erosion. The center of power shifted. Susa rose. Persepolis grew. The court did not return to Babylon as often. The city, once the eye of the world, became a quieter corner in a wider field. Its people still lived proudly. They still recited the tales of Gilgamesh, still taught their children the old myths, still believed that the Tigris would carry their hopes forward. But they also sensed the change, a drifting, a dimming. Babylon was no longer the heart. It was a chamber, still beating, but distant from the pulse of the new order. The city did not resent this, not openly. There were no grand rebellions, only murmurs, no statues toppled, only dust gathering slower on their shoulders. The Persians did not neglect Babylon, but they didn't center it either, and so it remained intact, honored, slowly dimming. The scribes who once recorded the movements of stars began to write shorter texts. The schools still taught, but fewer came. The temples still lit their fires, but the processions grew smaller. And yet, even in this twilight, there was grace. The fall of Babylon was not a collapse. It was a laying down of burden, of pride, of the need to stand above all others. In becoming part of Persia, it became something quieter, but perhaps more enduring. A memory not erased, but carried in the architecture of Achaemenid capitals, in the law codes preserved and adapted, in the sense of balance that Babylon had once known and Persia learned to hold. The city's wisdom, its geometry, its astronomy, its poetics filtered into the wider empire like wine through cloth, staining thought with elegance. In Persepolis, one might find a pattern in stone that once adorned a Babylonian tablet. In Susa, a legal term lifted from ancient Mesopotamian decrees, the knowledge did not vanish. It transformed, whispered into other scripts, taught in other languages, and Babylon, for all its fading, still dreamed. In the evenings, when the sky turned amber and the air cooled, parents still told stories by lamplight, children still traced the constellations with their fingers, traders still crossed the bridges beneath banners that now bore the seal of the Persian king, and in the corners of temples, old priests still offered incense, not in defiance, but in continuity, a thread unbroken, though now woven into a larger cloth. That was the genius of Cyrus. He did not conquer by crushing. He conquered by carrying. He lifted what had been and walked forward with it. And in doing so, he allowed Babylon not to end, but to exhale, to rest, to become not a ruin, but a foundation, a root beneath the new tree. And though the walls would one day crumble, though the gates would fall, the soul of Babylon, its measured speech, its high regard for knowledge, its belief in the divine shape of order would go on, hidden in coins, echoed in prayers, flickering in the stories that still began, in the time when kings walked with gods. They are not named in the tall inscriptions. Their faces do not gaze from coin or statue, but without them, the empire would have frayed like cloth left in sun and storm. The women of Persia, noble and servant, mother and maiden, were the quiet thread that bound the tapestry of the Achaemenid world, not by decree, but by presence. In the high-walled gardens of Susa, behind latticed windows and shaded colonnades, they moved like wind through silk, unseen by many, but felt by all. Their power was not loud. It did not shout across courts or ride at the head of armies, but it flowed through letters written in the dark, through dowries given not as gifts but as leverage, through the naming of sons and the shaping of futures. A noble woman in Persepolis might never lift a sword, but she might arrange a marriage that ended a war. She might whisper to her husband of grain shortages, of tensions in the satrapy, of which general harbored quiet ambition, and he would listen not because she commanded, but because she knew. Women in the royal household were educated. They read, they wrote, they accounted. In the records of Persepolis tablets pressed with the firm hands of scribes, their names appear beside rations, allowances, directives, artistone, amestris, Parasatis daughters and wives of kings, women who did not inherit thrones but shaped those who did. They owned estates, they managed staff, they oversaw the production of cloth, the distribution of wages, the hiring of workers, some supervised hundreds. Their instructions, precise and documented, tell of a world where women held reins, not only of households, but of supply chains, trade routes, and policy whispers. In the countryside, away from the scent of incense and the murmur of the court, women tended fields beside their husbands. They spun wool, fermented yogurt, dug irrigation ditches, and told stories over grinding stones. Their strength was in repetition in the daily liturgy of labor that kept families fed, festivals prepared, and villages whole. They lit fires before dawn, coaxed bread from dry flour, bathed children who would one day bow before kings. And though no scribe etched their names in stone, their work was the empire's pulse. Marriage, in Persian life, was less a cage than a contract. Women entered it not as property, but as partners bound by duty. Yes, but not erased. Divorce was possible. Property could be inherited, held, transferred. In wills discovered on crumbling tablets, women appear as heirs, as executors, as creditors. In one, a mother leaves cattle and linens to her daughters. In another, a widow claims land her late husband owed her. They moved within the law not as shadows, but as presences. Even religion gave them space. In the fire temples of Zoroastrianism, purity mattered more than gender. Women bathed, dressed in white, and tended sacred flames just as men did. They observed ritual, gave offerings, and walked within spaces many ancient faiths would have barred to them. Their voices were prayers, their gestures part of the cosmic balance. In death, too, they were honored, their remains placed with the same care, their names spoken in remembrance, their lives folded gently into the lineage of memory. But perhaps their greatest influence lay in what was never written in the stories told from knee to ear, in the lullabies that carried history not as fact, but as feeling, in the subtle shaping of minds before they were taught to speak. A prince learns first from the voice of his mother. He learns to listen, to wait, to feel, and that shaping, invisible but permanent, becomes part of the way he rules. The most cunning advisors, the most beloved kings, all once watched their mothers move through corridors and gardens, solving, soothing, enduring, and they carried that rhythm with them, even when they forgot where it came from. Even rebellion, sometimes, wore a woman's scent. A noble woman denied her rights, a sister married off for alliance, then returning with vengeance in her silence. A mother who refused to bless a coup. Their hands rarely spilled blood, but they directed those who would. Some poisoned, some plotted, others simply waited, knowing that time, too, could be a weapon. Their methods were not written into the chronicles of generals, but they left marks in the sudden fall of a favored official, in the strange shift of inheritance, in the reshuffling of court alliances after a birth or a death. They wove behind veils, and what they wove held shape. In art, they were present on seals, in reliefs, in the delicate curve of bracelets shaped for smaller wrists. In poetry, They were evoked as symbols of virtue, of loss, of longing, of wisdom unspoken, and in memory, they endured not as icons, but as hearths, warm, central, sustaining. Foreign visitors noticed, Greek historians, often surprised by the autonomy of Persian women, wrote of their estates, their audiences with kings, their influence in court. They did not always approve, but they recorded, and their records, tinged with judgment, still revealed a truth that could not be ignored. Persian women were present, not at the edges, but within the heart. Even the myths carried this. Anahita, goddess of waters, rode a chariot of silver and light. She was fierce, radiant, a warrior of purity and life. To her, people prayed for children, for strength, for cleansing. Her temples echoed with footsteps of women who lit candles and poured libations with hands calloused from work and prayer alike. She was not a goddess of passivity. She was the river flowing, shaping, nourishing, eroding. That was the model. Not submission, but movement. Not silence, but song sung in a different octave. The empire's men ruled with policy, but the women, in their weaving, their watching, their whispering, ruled with continuity. They ensured that what was planted grew, that what was lost was mourned, that what was loved was remembered. And when the empire shook, when palaces cracked and armies failed, it was the women who gathered children, who saved what scrolls could be hidden, who kept the old stories breathing beneath the ashes. In the end, as always, they endured, not as names carved in stone, but as wind in the leaves, as warmth in bread, as quiet in rooms that still remember the sound of their steps. They were the soft hands behind hard decisions, the breath between laws, the keepers of the empire's soul. It did not begin with shouts. It never does. Rebellions, in an empire as vast and ancient as Persia, often began as murmurs low, indistinct, carried on wind through wheat fields, and between the pillars of silent temples. They were born not in rage, but in rhythm, in the slow, repeated sound of a tax too high, a harvest too low, a satrap who no longer listened. The empire, for all its grandeur, was human, and humans forget. They forget to be just, to be generous, to be present. In the provinces in the shaded groves of Ionia, the deltaed rivers of Egypt, the rocky ridges of Armenia, people began to feel the empire not as a shield, but as a weight. And though the flame of loyalty still burned, it flickered. First came whispers, then came delays, tribute arriving late, soldiers turning away, messages unanswered, then a refusal, then a spark. In Ionia, far across the Aegean from the polished halls of Persepolis, Greek cities stirred. They had once bowed, grudgingly, to Persian governors, but pride grew like ivy on the walls of memory. Tales of ancestors who had fought for their own voice, their own tongue, were told anew in homes lit by oil lamps and defiance. It was not that Persia had ruled cruelly, but that it had ruled long, and time dulls gratitude. The Ionian revolt came like a crack in a frozen lake. It was small, localized, yet it sent ripples through the empire's still surface. Darius responded swiftly, not with fury, but with structure fleets dispatched, satraps reinforced, cities retaken one by one, with fire where needed, and clemency where possible. He understood rebellion not as betrayal, but as imbalance. To him, the realm was a garden, and a weed was not evil. It simply needed pruning. But not all saw it so. In Egypt, the people remembered their own crowns. They had bowed to Persia, yes, but only after seeing temples left untouched and priests honored. Yet as generations passed, and rulers grew more distant, something hardened. When Xerxes came to the throne and tried to press Egypt more tightly into the imperial mold, the Nile itself seemed to resist. Crops failed, the sun scorched too long, and then the priests, those keepers of tradition older than kings, turned their eyes toward the past and whispered of freedom. The revolt was swift. Temples closed their gates, cities turned away envoys, and Xerxes, unlike his father, chose not to listen, he chose to remind. He sent troops. The rebellion was crushed. The temples reopened, but the gods inside them were silent. Egypt, that ancient heart, did not forget. In later years, it would rise again and again, like a tide pulled by memory rather than strategy. Armenia too stirred. The mountains there bred independence, harsh winters, isolated valleys, a culture of endurance. The satraps often found their rule in Armenia more suggestion than command, and when the center showed weakness, the highlands responded with distance. The satrap's tax collector would vanish on a road once patrolled. Soldiers would arrive to find the village empty, the people scattered like starlings. The rebellion there was not loud. It was evasive, like mist rising from snow. Yet it required attention, and attention cost energy. Coin, men, even within the court, rebellions festered, not with swords, but with silence. A general who delayed a message, a noble who miscounted tribute, a prince who asked questions he should not have. The center held, but at cost. What made the Persian Empire remarkable was not that it avoided rebellion, but that it absorbed it. It flexed, it adjusted, it forgave. The empire knew when to punish, and more importantly, when to pardon. After battle came rebuilding. After fire, reconstruction. The roads were cleared, the wells were dug again. The satrap replaced or forgiven. Life continued, but each rebellion left a mark, a faint scar across the map. And over time, the skin of the empire bore many, some barely visible, others deep. Bactria, Egypt, Ionia, Armenian names that repeated in records like old wounds reopened. And yet, the empire endured, because even as it was challenged, it remained preferable to chaos. Most rebellions were not born of hatred, but of hunger, of neglect. And when the crown returned attention to these places, food, justice, presence, the embers dimmed. That was Persia's strength, not permanence, not invincibility, but its ability to learn, to listen, to respond. Yet, as the centuries turned, something began to shift. The balance, once tended so carefully, began to tilt. The kings became more distant, the court more ceremonial, the satraps richer, but less loyal. The people, who had once felt seen, began to feel ruled. And when the rebellions came now, they were not only acts of survival, they were acts of judgment. The trust had thinned. The flame of shared destiny flickered. The empire still stood, tall and wide, its banners clean and golden, but beneath the surface, the murmurs grew louder. And murmurs, if not heard, become voices. Voices, if not answered, become storms. In the quiet valleys of rebellion, the seeds of ending were planted, not by enemies, but by forgetfulness. And the greatest threat to any empire is not rage, it is indifference. The Achaemenids, in their wisdom, had built a realm that could withstand anger, but they had forgotten to tend the silence. And silence, when left too long, speaks in fire. He came not as a diplomat, nor a merchant, nor even a prophet. He came as a storm, walking in the borrowed dust of Achilles and dreaming in the armor of myth. Alexander of Macedon, whose name would echo louder than most in the canyons of time, didn't arrive at the gates of Persia with a desire to understand. He arrived with a hunger that knew no season. The empire he faced was still vast, still dignified, still draped in silks and inked in laws, but it was weary. Weary not in structure, but in soul. The kings that followed Xerxes had ruled, had built, had issued orders in the cadence of tradition, but something vital had thinned. Like a voice repeating a prayer no longer felt, Darius III, last of the Achaemenids, was no fool. But he was born into a rhythm that no longer matched the pulse of the world. He inherited an empire that had learned to endure, but had forgotten how to respond. And so when the northern wind rose, bringing with it this young Macedonian whose eyes were set on stars only he could see, Persia heard it, but too late. Alexander moved like flame across dry grass. The battles were brutal, but swift. Granicus, Essus, Gaugamela names carved into the memory of conquest. The Persian army, vast and ornamented, buckled not from weakness, but from confusion. Orders were lost in the dust, camels crashed into each other, loyal satraps fled or fell, and Darius, once robed in majesty, found himself pursued through the empire he was meant to command. But Alexander, even in conquest, was not simply a destroyer. His eyes glittered not only with ambition, but with fascination. He had read of Persia. He had heard of Cyrus and Darius. He did not wish to raise an empire. He wished to become it. And so, as he moved through the royal cities, Susa, Babylon, Ecbatana, he did not always burn. He admired. He adapted. He knelt before the tomb of Cyrus and Pasargadae, brushing dust from the stone with his own hand. He adopted Persian dress. He married Persian women. He commanded his men to do the same, forging bonds not of blood, but of breath and custom. And yet, not all was reverence. At Persepolis, in a night soaked with wine and smoke, the great palace that dream in stone was set alight. Whether by plan or impulse, by strategy or intoxication, it burned. The fire climbed the columns. It licked the reliefs. It swallowed the carved languages and left only glowing bones of a world that had once taught the meaning of patience. Some say Alexander wept the next morning, that he walked among the ashes barefoot, that he touched the scorched walls with trembling hands. Whether in remorse or in revelation, no one knows. But the act marked a line. Persia was no longer a place to admire. It was a crown to wear, and wear it he did. He installed governors, restored temples, consulted with Zoroastrian priests, but the empire, though conquered, did not fully accept him. The Persians, though polite, remained distant. The nobles bowed, but their eyes did not soften. The people offered what was asked, but not their hearts. Alexander had broken the shell, but he could not drink the spirit. His attempt to fuse Macedonian and Persian, to create a unity of East and West, was grand but uneasy. His men resented the robes. The Persians questioned the oaths. The court became a stage of tension, a place where identity flickered like a flame too closely watched. And then, as suddenly as he had arrived, Alexander began to fade, fever-struck, or poison, or exhaustion. His body collapsed in Babylon, the very city that had once surrendered to Cyrus with grace. As he lay dying, the empire he had tried to forge had not yet gelled. His generals hovered like vultures. His vision, still unfinished, dissolved with his breath. What he left behind was not Persia reborn, but Persia scattered. The satrapies fractured, the lands divided, the Seleucids came, then the Parthians, then others. None would wear the crown as the Achaemenids once had. None would be the garden and the road, the fire and the law, the silence and the voice. And yet, Persia did not vanish. It withdrew into stories, into customs, into the hearts of its people, who remembered the days when their kings ruled not by fear, but by patience. The memory of order remained. The Zoroastrian fire still burned. The language still carried the rhythm of empire. Alexander's shadow was long, yes, but Persia had walked in sunlight for centuries before he arrived. The empire had been a lesson, a teacher of moderation, of tolerance, of how to hold difference in one hand and justice in the other. And though its banners had fallen, its soul slipped quietly into the roots of all that followed. In the dust of ruined capitals, seeds waited. In old women's songs, names lingered. In children's games, the echoes of old parades danced. The empire, even in defeat, had taught the world how to hold itself with grace. And when Alexander died, young and unfulfilled, it was Persia that whispered over his grave not in hatred, but in sadness, not because he had conquered, but because he had not understood. The heart of the empire was never gold or armies. It was time. It was listening. It was the willingness to let 1,000 voices speak at once, and to hear them all. That was what Alexander, for all his greatness, could not grasp. And that was what Persia, even in silence, never forgot. It begins with wind not fierce, not sudden, but constant, like breath pulled endlessly through a hollow reed. It moves through stone that once bore voices, through pillars that once held shade for kings, through courtyards where the laughter of foreign envoys once mingled with the fragrance of saffron and smoke. Now, it carries only dust and the memory of rhythm. Persepolis stands not whole, not fallen, but paused. Its great columns rise like ancient trees whose leaves have long since crumbled, their capitals carved with bulls and scrolls and silent strength. The steps are worn, but they remain, and if you walk them barefoot, as some pilgrims still do, you can feel the grooves where thousands once climbed, courtiers in embroidered robes, gardeners bringing garlands, generals called to report, priests murmuring prayers to the sky. No voice echoes now, but the place listens. The ruins do not mourn. They remember. In the early light, when the sun strikes the stone at an angle just so, you can still see the shadows of figures in procession carved into the walls. They have not moved in 2,000 years yet, somehow. They are not still. Ethiopians leading antelope, Elamites carrying coiled cords, Medes offering woven cloth, each etched with care, each face distinct, each gesture deliberate. They are not slaves. They are participants in a dream once believed permanent, a world of order, of dignity, of many paths leading to a single court where respect was currency and peace, the unspoken law. The fire temples, now cold, once breathed light into night. Priests kept vigil by flames that represented not destruction but clarity, a reminder that all things could be lit from within. Even now, when the wind shifts just right, it smells faintly of ash and frankincense. Travelers come, some seeking history, others simply silence. They stand beneath archways whose keystones still hold. They touch the walls, expecting coldness, but finding instead a strange warmth, as if the stone remembers hands that once shaped it, swept it, leaned against it in weariness or joy. Children chase each other between fallen blocks. A woman unfolds a blanket on the grass and lays out pomegranates, as if waiting for someone who has not yet arrived. And, overhead, birds circle. They perch on the heads of kings long dethroned, their wings brushing stone beards carved by long-dead hands. Time, here, is layered, not gone, just quiet. In Susa, in Ecbatana, in the cities where Persian governors once received messages delivered by riders who crossed the empire faster than belief. The streets have narrowed, the markets changed. But if you sit in a tea house and listen, really listen, you will still hear something ancient in the cadence of speech, in the way elders tell stories. They speak of just kings, of wide roads, of years when the harvest came early and the taxes were fair. They don't name the empire. They don't need to. It lingers in the air, not as a claim, but as a condition. In the museums of the world, the objects remain cylinder seals, golden cups, ivory combs, scrolls of commands and poetry, garments preserved in dry soil. Scholars analyze them. They debate dates, provenance, significance, but the objects are not concerned with debate. They are content to have survived. A tiny bead, once sewn into a robe for a child in the palace, now rests behind glass in silence, bearing witness to the fact that beauty was once made not for display, but for presence. In libraries, the names still live: Artaxerxes, Atossa, Cambyses, some remembered for war, others for peace, some only for being born between others. Their biographies, often reconstructed from fragments and echoes, tell less than the walls they left behind, and yet, the attempt to know them is itself a kind of offering, a reaching towards something that never asked to be eternal, yet refuses to fade. The ruins of the empire do not preach. They do not rise from the desert demanding to be seen. They wait, patiently, and in that patience, they speak a lesson deeper than any inscription. That power is not permanence. That greatness is not in volume. That legacy, if it is to last, must be quiet enough to endure being forgotten and kind enough to be remembered without force. In modern Iran, children still learn the words of Ferdowsi, who sang the stories of old kings, some real, some imagined, but all glowing with a sense of rightness, of order, of meaning. And though his verses came long after the Achaemenids, the spirit he caught had roots in their world, that of justice, of balance, of the desire to hold many things in one hand without letting any fall. Even in architecture, echoes remain. Courtyards that open to the sky, gardens that divide water into channels with mathematical grace, doors that face east, walls that hold light rather than reflect it. The empire lives in angles and silence. It lives in the practice of patience, in the reverence for hospitality, in the belief that every voice, no matter how small, deserves a place to speak. And perhaps this is what Persia gave to time: not conquest, not wealth, not monuments meant to awe, but a model of how to hold difference with dignity. An idea that empires need not shout to be strong, that a kingdom could be built not by forcing all to kneel, but by inviting all to stand. The columns still rise, the carvings still whisper, and when the wind comes, as it always does, it doesn't tear through the ruins. It moves with them, among them, like a visitor paying quiet respects, not to what was lost, but to what was made, and to what, in some strange, soft way, still remains. Long after the banners of Alexander had withered, long after his generals carved the empire into uneasy fragments, and Greek blended with Persian in the bazaars of vanished cities, a new breath stirred from the mountains. It did not trumpet its arrival. It did not proclaim itself a rebirth. But in the highlands of Pars, among stones that still remembered the old kings, the Sassanid dynasty rose not from the dust of ambition alone, but from the memory that had never truly died. For centuries, the Achaemenid name had slept, not in silence, but in song. Village elders had whispered of the just kings. Priests of the sacred flame had murmured prayers that once danced across Persepolis, and in homes where grandmothers traced lines on rugs with stories older than ink. The rhythm of the old empire pulsed like a heartbeat under floorboards. The Sassanids didn't need to invent Persia. They needed only to listen to what still lay in the soil. Ardashir, founder of the dynasty, didn't come as a stranger. He was of the land of its mountains, of its temples, of its grief. He didn't speak of imitation, but of continuation. And in his coronation, the old echoes stirred robes cut in familiar lines, incense rising in spirals, priests intoning the eternal flame's memory. Though centuries separated him from Darius and Xerxes, Ardashir stood not as a replacement, but as a reply. The world had changed. Rome now pressed at the western gate. Nomads stirred in the north. And yet, the Sassanid response was not fear, it was architecture. They built and built grandly palaces of stone and dome, arches that soared like birds about to take flight, vaults that carried sound like a song held aloft. But in their building, they remembered. The city of Ctesiphon grew not like a Greek colony, but like a Persian dream measured, flowing, anchored in water and sun. The great arch, Takht Khazra, stood not to declare dominance, but to shelter stories, to receive voices, to frame the empire's belief that space, when shaped with care, becomes more than shelter, it becomes sanctuary. Zoroastrianism, too, found its voice again. The flame, never extinguished, was fed anew. Under the Sassanids, it became not only spiritual, but administrative. Temples received lands, priests became advisors. Fire was no longer a metaphor, it was governance. Lit in gold bowls atop towers that watched the cities sleep. But unlike the narrow faiths of conquest, Zoroastrianism did not hunt the different. Christians, Jews, Manichaeans all found spaces in the empire, not equal, not free of pressure, but present, tolerated, recognized. It was not a perfection, but it was a memory of a time when many voices sang into one court, and all were heard. The Sassanid law bore the stamp of this heritage. In its scrolls and verdicts, one finds not only punishment, but mediation and understanding that justice was not vengeance, but balance restored. And in this, the Achaemenid breath flowed still. Darius had carved justice into stone. The Sassanids wrote it into practice, into documents signed in marketplaces, into resolutions reached in courtyards beneath fig trees. Women, too, re-emerged not only as symbols, but as presences. Queens advised kings. Noble women managed estates, ordered silk from the east, and dictated how many oxen would be sent with the next caravan. Though the laws were rigid, life found ways to flex, and in that quiet flexibility, the memory of the Achaemenid balance endured. The Sassanid kings wore crowns heavier and more ornate, their jewels carved to catch light from every angle. They minted coins not just to declare lineage, but to assert continuity. Fire altars beside their profiles, inscriptions not in Greek but Middle Persian. Their faces looked ahead, but their minds looked back. They sent envoys to China. They traded with India. They battled with Rome. But in their hearts, they ruled over an inheritance. They knew that to rule Persia was not to create, but to remember with action. Even their gardens, though more elaborate, bore the same signature symmetry: water, fruit, shade, reflection, paradise. Still, in battles, they were fierce. At Al-Qadisiyah, at Edessa, at Dara, they defended not only borders, but a vision. And though the vision dimmed at times through the court intrigue, through invasion, through the corrosion that comes when tradition becomes routine, it never vanished. When Khosrau Babripti, perhaps the greatest of them, ruled, he was called Anushiravan of immortal soul. He reformed taxes, built canals, supported philosophers. When Justinian closed the schools of Athens, it was Persia that welcomed their exiled scholars. The last light of Greek philosophy flickered not in Rome, but in the twilight of a Persian court where thought still mattered. Yet time is patient. Empires, even those built on memory, are not immune to its drift. The Arabs came not as traders, but as bearers of a new fire, a new word, a new god. And though the Sassanids fought, and bravely, the tide could not be turned. At Al-Qadisiyah, the royal standard fell. Yazdegerd III, last of his line, fled. And in the long retreat that followed, the light dimmed. But Persia did not vanish. Islam arrived. But beneath it, the garden pattern remained. The road logic remained. The reverence for poetry, for order, for hospitality remained. And Zoroaster's fire, though hidden, flickered still, in hearts, in homes, in festivals reimagined. No ruse survived. The old gods became metaphors. The old stories wore new names. But the rhythm of the Achaemenids moved forward. It's easy to speak of conquest, to measure history by swords and treaties. But the deeper truth, the Persian truth, lies elsewhere. It lies in how an idea that power can be quiet, that difference can be dignity, that law can be love in structure was passed like a seed through fire, through wind, through forgetting. The Sassanids were not copies. They were continuations. They stood where the old kings once stood, looked to the same sky, prayed by the same flame, and in their hands, though the soil had changed, the roots grew again. And even now, if you walk among the ruins of their palaces, if you trace your fingers along the worn brick of Takhasra, or stand beneath the arch and listen to the wind pass through, it is there, the echo, not of war, not of fall, but of remembering, of breath continuing, of seeds still sleeping, waiting for the right hands to plant them once more. There were no borders drawn in ink that could contain it, no single road that defined it, and no empire, however vast, that could fully own it. Persia had become something more than a place, more than a throne, more even than a memory. It had become a current, moving beneath the skin of centuries, carrying with it silk and fire and a way of seeing the world that outlasted kings. The Silk Road, winding its serpentine path from China to the Mediterranean, passed through Persia not as a guest, but as a native. For what Persia offered was not only geography, but rhythm, the rhythm of resting stations spaced like beads on a string, the pulse of hospitality woven into caravanserais where strangers were treated as kin, where a bowl of warm stew and a basin of clean water could speak louder than coin. Traders came from the east, their camels burdened with a silk that shimmered like dragonfly wings, dyed in colors that seemed drawn from dreams. From the west came glass, shaped by Phoenician fire, delicate and precise. From the north came furs, thick and musty with the scent of snow. From the south came incense, pungent and sacred, and spices that danced on the tongue like music. But what passed through Persia was not just goods, it was thought. In the shaded courtyards of Herat, of Ray, of Nishapur, ideas paused to breathe. Buddhists, Manichaeans, Nestorians, Jews, and Zoroastrians passed one another in marketplaces, their robes brushing, their eyes meeting, sometimes with caution, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with kinship. It was here that translation bloomed. Greek texts, long carried in scrolls from Alexandria and Antioch, were copied into Middle Persian. Astronomers gazed at the same stars, even if they named them differently. Physicians debated humors and herbs over tea. Mathematicians scribbled figures in the dust with sticks, nodding in agreement though their tongues stumbled to match. Ideas did not belong to flags. They belonged to longing, the longing to understand, to heal, to name the pattern in the chaos. And Persia welcomed that longing. It gave it room. It gave it roads. It gave it respect. Beneath this exchange, the sacred fire still burned, not always in grand temples, not always in public, but in the hearts of families who remembered, in secluded places where priests still whispered the gathas, where children were taught to wash their hands before lighting the lamp, where Nowruz was still marked with hyacinths, mirrors, candles, and the silence of remembering. Zoroastrianism, no longer the faith of kings, became something quieter and perhaps more durable, not an institution, but a practice, a way of walking, a way of noticing the divine in the balance of things. Fire became less about flame and more about clarity. In homes carved into hillsides, the fire burned without being seen, and yet everyone felt it. It was in the kindness to a traveler, in the honesty of a trade, in the way an elder's advice was heeded not because it was law, but because it rang with something older than time. And alongside fire, the silk, always the silk, that symbol of what moves gently and endures. Persian weavers became masters of softness and strength. Their carpets told stories not just of gardens and beasts and vines, but of order, of symmetry, of what it meant to walk across beauty with bare feet and feel steadied. These carpets traveled farther than armies ever did, to Byzantium, to Delhi, to the courts of Europe where kings marveled at how softness could hold such structure. But to Persians, it was not marvel, it was memory. The carpet was a garden, the garden was a vision, and the vision a world where all things had their place, their voice, their light. Poets carried this vision in verse. Ferdowsi, Rumi, Hafez, each in their time spoke not only of love and longing, but of Persia itself, not always directly. Sometimes through allegory, sometimes through laughter, sometimes through wine and roses and stars and silence. But always, underneath, was the thread that something had been beautiful, that something still was, and that something might be again if only we remembered how to see. The poets did not glorify kings. They glorified grace, the way a drop of water falls, the way a word, softly spoken, can open a heart, the way loss, if held rightly, can become wisdom. Through their words, Persia became not history, but a mood. Not a map, but a melody, and that melody found listeners far beyond the desert and the mountains. In India, where Persian became the language of the courts and love letters. In Central Asia, where mosques bore verses from Persian poets etched into tile like prayers that needed no priest. In the Ottoman lands, where sultans recited Hafez and carried his verses in battle not for courage, but for direction. Even in the far reaches of China, fragments of Persian remained in merchant dialects and cooking spices, the echo of a time when the world's spine ran through the bazaars of Samarkand and Shiraz. And yet, for all its reach, Persia never shouted. It hummed. It moved through time like a wind that lifts but does not break, that scatters seeds rather than ashes. It taught not by conquest, but by example that beauty was a kind of wisdom, that order could be soft, that memory could outlast monument. The empires rose and fell, the Sassanids passed, the caliphates shifted, the Mongols thundered in and left silence in their wake. But beneath it all, Persia remained, in the geometry of tile, in the ritual of tea poured 3 times, in the shade of a pomegranate tree under which a child is told a story that begins, once, in a time of kings. That child may not know Cyrus, may not know Darius, may never see Persepolis, but the story will shape them, the pause between words, the reverence for the past, the sense that life is both fragile and worth adorning. That is the Persian gift. Silk, fire, memory, moving through the centuries not to be preserved in glass, but to be worn, lived, lit, and remembered, not as empire, but as presence, as a way of being, as a whisper that never quite leaves the air. When the last kings had faded into names, when the fire temples crumbled into echoes and the great roads disappeared beneath dust and root, Persia did not end. It simply changed its shape. No longer an empire ruled from a golden throne. It became something quieter, a breath held in the folds of language, a scent carried in rose gardens, a rhythm felt in the slow pour of tea. The twilight of Persian Empire was not collapse, but transformation. It became memory, not the brittle memory of dates and decrees, but the living memory that glows in gesture and custom, in poetry recited beneath moonlight, in silence that still knows how to speak, in the shaded courtyards of Shiraz, in the winding alleys of Yazd, in the valleys where children chase goats across stone and shadow. The soul of Persia still walked not as a shadow of what was lost, but as a presence that had learned to walk without noise. The languages changed. The gods took new names, but the gaze, that calm, inward, watchful gaze that once shaped empires remained. It looked out through the eyes of weavers threading patterns passed down through lifetimes. It moved in the hands of potters spinning shapes the earth had known before there were kings. It stirred in the voices of women telling their daughters to be still, to listen, to remember. This twilight was not defeat. It was patience. The kind of patience only a culture that has known glory and ruin in equal measure can understand. A patience that knows how to wait not for return, not for vengeance, but for depth. In the quiet, Persia studied itself, in gardens now grown wild, in books now copied in secret, in rituals now held in homes instead of temples. It learned what remained when power departed, and what remained was dignity. The simple dignity of a table laid with care, of calligraphy inked with reverence, of hospitality offered not as duty, but as joy. No empire lasts forever, but a way of being, if shaped with grace, can ripple beyond its boundaries. The Persians knew this. That is why they didn't mourn like others. When walls fell, they planted vines. When names changed, they wrote poems. When rulers spoke in tongues not their own, they listened, then replied in metaphor. They became the whisper in the ear of time. And the whisper said, not all strength shouts. It said, what is taken by force fades. What is offered with beauty endures. It said, we are still here, though you may not see us. In the twilight, the world moved on. New maps were drawn, new banners raised. But in the hush beneath the noise, Persia remained. A cup filled carefully, a carpet woven with longing. A hand placed on a shoulder just long enough to say, I see you. In every act of elegance, in every moment where form met feeling, Persia was there, not in domination but in influence, not in temples but in tones, not in monuments but in meanings. Even the stars seemed to recall their old names when spoken in a certain accent, under a certain breath. Twilight is not darkness. It is the softest light. It is the place where memory glows without burning. And in this light, Persia walks still not toward a future it must seize, but within a present it quietly shapes. A merchant offers figs with both hands. A scholar reads Hafiz to a child beneath a jasmine. A mason lays stone as if it were prayer. None speak of empire. All remember its stillness. That was the final gift. Not rule, not legacy, but presence. A way of living that does not insist, but invites. A way of seeing that does not conquer, but contemplates. A way of being that does not demand reverence, yet quietly receives it. And so, as the twilight deepens and the world forgets once more, Persia continues not in the pages of history, but in the space between silence and word, between offering and acceptance, between the fall of empires and the rise of grace. A child dips their fingers in ink. An old man adjusts the wick of a lamp. A garden waits for morning, and through them all, Persia breathes. And now, the story softens. The names fall away like leaves at dusk. The battles grow quiet. The palace is dim, only the wind remains moving gently through time, brushing against old stone, stirring the memory of what once was, and what, perhaps, still lingers. In the hush of night, when the world forgets its noise, you might still feel it Persia, not as empire, not as history, but as warmth, in the way someone pauses before speaking, in the careful folding of cloth, in the hush before a prayer. It is not gone. It has simply chosen to speak in smaller ways. There is a kind of strength that needs no monument, a kind of beauty that asks for no crown. The Persians understood this, that the deepest power lives in what is offered without demand. The garden tended quietly, the road kept clean for strangers, the poem whispered just before sleep. It endures in the unseen, in the breath before the verse, in the stillness after the fire. And so the empire, long dissolved, continues to ripple through hearts that remember without knowing why, through gestures, through customs, through the silent dignity of grace. No empire lasts, but the way a people live, the way they choose to love, to honor, to shape the world around them, that is what remains. So sleep now, not with sorrow, but with wonder. Let the past fold gently around you, like a worn and welcome robe. The story is not over. It has only changed its rhythm. And in the rhythm, in the breath, in the quiet, Persia still dreams.